Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Streamlining Communication Terminology Management webinar. This is a topic we spend quite a bit of time on, particularly with new clients that are getting ready for translation or those that are coming from a situation where there's been quality inconsistency issues with the current translation workflow. So we're excited to present this to you all. This is our first time on the On24 system, so I believe there's a Q&A or a Ask Questions link at the bottom of the screen and also on the bottom right, so please do ask questions and we'll be answering those at the end. My name is Mike McDermott. I'm the Director of Language Services for Mad Translations, and for those that don't know Mad Translations is the translation services group offered by Madcap Software. We're an ISO certified translation vendor, and as you can imagine, we do a lot of translation work with Flare projects in the client base for Madcap Software. So I am joined by Scott Bass, a longtime partner to Mad Translations. I'll refer to him as a friend and mentor as well, and he's excited to join us as well. So Scott, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, but please do ask questions. If you need anything, we'll be available in the chat.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Mike. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. Just before we get started, the webinar is being recorded, and registrants will receive a link to that recording, I think within 48 hours of the completion of the webinar. And as Mike said, use the question panel at the lower right to post any questions you may have during, while I'm presenting. So yes, my name is Scott Bass. I'm a kind of a language services lifer right now, I'll call myself. I've been in the industry since the early 90s and have my own language service company that I had sold back in 2015. And I've partnered with Mad Translations for many years, and basically working as a consultant with Mad Translations. This topic is really, I was joking with Mike earlier that this is kind of an intergenerational topic for me. I presented on this topic over the years, and because it's a theme that kind of keeps coming back. It's a drum that within the industry, we very often feel we have to keep beating because it's not a well-known practice. Terminology management and taking a proactive approach to how you deal with the specialized terminology of the field that you work in is really a discipline. And because it's a discipline, it's sometimes hard to maintain. And so I'm going to talk today about why is it important to focus on terminology within your organization? Some of the things that we're going to touch on is how does managing terminology impact cost control? How can it help you improve internal communication within your organization? What impact does it have on your corporate brand? And how does it, as Mike alluded to, how it can impact the kind of the speed, efficiency, and cost of translation overall? So those are the things that I hope you walk away having learned something about today. So when it comes to terminology management's impact on cost, I'm going to get a little bit into some basic math of how translation costing works and how the cost of a single word can really balloon your costs very quickly. And I'll demonstrate that with a simple example. So as many probably already know, translation is still generally costed out on a per word basis. You pay pennies per word to your translation provider. This is for every word that gets translated, with some interesting exceptions. This is a very old model. It's still heavily debated within the industry if this is a model the industry still wants to use. There are some experimenting out there with hourly costs for translation, the same way content gets authored. But for the most part, translation, I'd say 95% across the industry, is still going to be priced out on a per word basis. So if we look at the cost of a single word, and in this case, we're going to take the word handle as a term of interest, not a particularly technical term. Most of us touch handles all day, but sometimes we may call them knobs or grips or pulls, like for example, in a kitchen. So if you look at translating the single word handle, your translation provider, and oh, by the way, all pricing here is just for example purposes. It doesn't reflect anything that Mad Translations might quote or any other vendor will quote. I pulled it out of thin air, and it's just for demonstration purposes. But if we translate the word handle, that single word at the base cost, English to German or whatever language, might be 23 cents. Okay. And now, if I use all the different variants of the term or the synonyms of the term, handle, knob, grip, pull, that's going to, each time I translate one of those words, it's going to add up. And so if they appear at least once, it's going to be 92 cents. Okay. Now consider a whole sentence. And the sample sentence is, the machine must be secured against unintentional movement at the end of each shift. To do so, the machine operator must turn the handle 90 degrees clockwise and enter the preset 4-digit code on the keypad. The machine will then be locked. Okay, so the term we're still talking about is handle. It's used one time in the sentence. And the cost to do this whole sentence using that 23 cent per word rate, because this is the first time we're seeing this sentence as translators that say, so new text is $9.43. Don't fall off your chairs. That's a realistic cost in the translation world. Yes, a sentence can cost you nearly 10 bucks. That's why this gets important very quickly. The one thing to note is that based on how your translation provider uses another technology that we're not going to go into detail today, you're welcome to ask questions later about it if you'd like, is translation memory. In short, translation memory is a way to capture text and reuse it. So the first time we translate the sentence, it's going to cost $9.43. But based on translation memory costing, we're only going to charge 10%, let's say, or your translation provider will only charge 10% of that cost if the sentence repeats. There is usually a discount for repetition when translation memory tools are being used by a translation provider. So that the cost of that sentence, if it repeats, could drop to 94 cents. All right, that's a pretty good savings, 90% savings. So now, let's say this sentence repeats, but instead of using the word handle, we use knob instead. This has a pretty significant impact on the costing, because now this is no longer a repetition or what would have been a 100% match if the word handle had been used. It's now a 99% match. Well, in most cases, because of what we call a partial match, the translator, individual translator engaging that sentence actually has to look for the difference and make sure they're accounting for that difference. So it requires more attention from the translator, more time. So as I said before, repetition of the sentence would have cost only 94 cents. But now that it's a 99% match, it could cost as much as, let's say, 50%, so $4.72. So in effect, just because we did not use the same term, that one word, knob, effectively cost me $3.78 instead of just 23 cents. Okay. So in other words, because of inconsistency in terminology, we weren't seeing high-level matches or 100% matches in our translation memory tool. And that's the real-world impact of inconsistency on translation costs. Never mind the other issues that arise when we use inconsistent terminology. So jumping from cost, if we talk about improving internal communication, depending on your organization and what you do, this could be a big issue or not. If you're talking about software or technical tools, this could be a significant issue across departments. If engineering calls something a handle, marketing calls it a grip, and sales calls it a knob. You're all using different terms. Internally, it may not have a ton of impact. Everybody kind of gets what's going on. But overall, this is a very simple example, so it seems innocuous, but in more complex scenarios where the terminology is more technical, you can imagine this could quickly cause ambiguities between departments and confusion. Plus, when you're working ideally as a unit, it really does help build cohesion with the organization if you speak literally the same language, right? This is why jargons appear within companies and within industries, because humans like it when we share the same language. So having consistent terminology, quite simply, can improve internal communication in your organization. Now, when it comes to quality improvement, that's another important facet of managing terminology. As I mentioned, it can help unify departments using consistent terminology. It can accelerate new staff training. Again, if you think about a technical product where terminology may be more opaque, difficult to learn, if someone's confronted with multiple terms for the same concept, this can slow down learning. So getting everyone literally on the same page using the same terms can help speed that learning process. Again, if you have confusion around functions and features due to terminology, that really can easily be avoided. And in the worst cases, inconsistent terminology can literally impact safety because, again, the messaging can become unclear, people can become confused as how to act or interact with a device or software, and depending on the scenario, it could be dangerous. So these are real-world things that we have to think about when communicating with users. Now, when it comes to branding, obviously, if you're talking about proprietary features and functions, a lot of thought usually goes into naming. And that's understandable, especially if it's going to end up in marketing. But even still, the decisions made by marketing may not trickle back into product development and into engineering. And this is how very often the inconsistencies can arise. But another facet of this is to think about the world that we live in, the webby world that we live in, the search-driven world that we live in. If you have unique features described by specific words, or I'll say keywords, that people are searching on, now it's really important to make sure that your terminology is in line across your organization so that marketing, for example, whoever's handling your content marketing, knows what terms are important for users. And those terms, because those terms are ones they will be searching on when trying to find more information about your product. So terms are not just terms, they can also be keywords used in search. And another facet that's rapidly emerging and growing is the use of data about your products in different AI scenarios, such as training chatbots, voice recognition software, and machine translation engines. So again, if you want to have good training data for these technologies, you really want to have good, consistent terminology that's accurate, that's accurate to your product, and also matches what people need to use when searching and learning about your product. And lastly, all this terminology is going to trickle out to the front end of your organization so that customer support, training, product training, marketing can use it. And so in the end, you need a process to backstop this to make sure that people are getting that information in a timely, accurate, consistent fashion. Now, if we talk more specifically about translation, I briefly have mentioned cost there, and the whole issue with translation memory matches and issues with terminology impacting that. And then the issue of training data is increasingly more and more important. A term list is one of the first things you can feed to a customizable translation engine to train it to speak more of your company's language. And more of these tools are being employed to lower the cost of translation. But one thing to note about translation and the translation process and what I'll call a modern workflow, including machine translation engines, for example, translators don't translate individual words. They really translate segments, sentences. Okay, in the industry we call them segments because it may not be an actual full sentence grammatically. It could be a headline or a title or something like that. But these segments stand alone. They get presented independently to the translator or machine translation engine in a content stream, and that's how the translator engages it. So modern translation tools and workflows focus on segments. The consistent use of correct terminology has a direct impact on segment quality, and then also the matching that I showed you before, okay? And the thing to keep in mind is that, higher level matches are usually cheaper, faster to process, and help you maintain quality over time. The more you have to deal with partial matches, takes more translator time, and can slow the process down. So the bottom line is that if there are more terms, there's simply more confusion. Again, my very simple example of handle, grip, knob, it's too simple to help you realize how this could come into effect in the translation process, how ambiguities arise. But I'll give you one example in my history. I literally had one translator in a software localization project post over 800 queries, the majority of which were related to terminology because the authors were just not very clear and consistent how they use terms. And a classic example from that particular project is that this was software used in the finance industry, and the word default was used within the software interface. But when translating software strings, it's very difficult to know the context. Now, default in software is a commonly used term, right? Commonly used term. It's a default setting or something like that, default preferences. But remember, this was finance. And in this case, default was a default on a loan. And with little context, the translator has no way of knowing what the term might mean. So that's something to keep in mind too. How much context does the translator have? Bottom line is, established documented terms enable faster, higher quality, and more efficient translation. Simple as that. So the real question for most organizations is how do you get started, right? This is a discipline, as I mentioned, and like with many disciplines, they're not welcomed by most everyone, especially for busy individuals and organizations who are already doing a lot of other things. But the thing with terminology management is the best way to get started is by starting simply. I think very often the process is made too complex too soon, overly robust in a way to get started, and that really can become a barrier to adoption. The goal here is to get people thinking about terminology first. The process and the whiz-bang tools to help drive it can come later. So to just start, the best way to do that is to collect what you already have. A lot of departments will create their own documentation internally for training purposes, lab notes, whatever you want to call it. And there could be a lot of terminology already floating around your company. So go on a scavenger hunt and find that stuff. Work with other departments. This is a good way to open the conversation with other departments is, hey, do you guys already have a list for this? Do you have any terminology you like to define and track within your group? While you're at it, collect their term lists, any other kind of glossaries they use, and also any style guides that might be floating around. Style guides are another useful tool. Nothing we'll address in detail today, but they're always useful to have. And very often style guides have a lot of commentary about terms, trademark usage, things like that, can help inform the terminology management process. But the biggest thing you need to do is establish this rapport with and consensus among department leaders to make this a priority. Because if terminology isn't seen as a priority, as I said, it's not going to be, you're not going to gain traction within your organization. And then having higher level sponsorship of the effort, someone at the upper tiers of management say, yeah, I get it. This could really have an impact on cost and time and quality. We really need to do this, make it happen. And they have to say that publicly so that people get that this is an undertaking that the company is taking seriously. So again, I was talking about simply starting, and one of the ongoing jokes within our industry about terminology management is we have really awesome software, but 90% of terminology management still happens where? In Excel. And there's a good reason for that. Excel is easy, flexible, ubiquitous. A lot of people know how to use it. So why not? And I'm not going to fight that trend. It makes sense to start off with a simple tool. The other benefit is we can do this all cloud-based through SharePoint or Google Drive or wherever. So utilizing Excel or Sheets to publish a term list is the fastest way to get people using it. I give a very simple version of a very basic term list. A term with a simple definition. A sample sentence is always super helpful, and a source. People want to know where those terms could be used. And then who submitted it and when. And then was it changed? Were there any updates? Just to have some light administrative tracking of what's going on with this list. So people can also know how current things are and when they might be out of date. All right. So establish some simple rules of how you're going to use this list. Maybe govern some access. I suggest small but effective groups. Have a committee who's heading this across departments, and they have edit access. Everyone else can view it and use it as a point of reference in their work. Make sure you meet periodically. It doesn't have to be weekly, it could be quarterly, after the initial work gets done. And then have some notification scheme to let people know when there are changes. Quite simply, I know some companies that just have a short email template around this that gets blasted out whenever someone takes responsibility to communicate to the larger audience about changes that are being made. It doesn't have to be a big complex thing to get started in this space. But the question we often get is, well, how do I know what really belongs in my term list, my glossary or my term list? Let's stick with term list as a standard name for this. Quite simply, the focus should be on what you need it to be, but you want to find a balance, right? You want to make sure you focus on the core technical terminology of your field. Those things really specific to the core subject matter that we're describing and writing about. You want to avoid including a lot of mundane language, everyday language, because those terms are usually easily reconciled. There might be choices there for stylistic preferences you want to include, but again, we don't want to bloat this list. We want it to be the most technically specific stuff that might be the hardest for people to understand, and also where inconsistencies may arise the most. All right. Even though my simple spreadsheet didn't include a field for images, more robust term bases do. When building a term list, if there's some way to capture images that describe them, that's also very helpful. Again, I wouldn't focus on that too much first phase, but It's something that as you evolve, you may want to have, especially again for more complex equipment where it's hard to visualize a component that the term is describing. Other things like part of speech, yeah, it's helpful to have that. I think linguists care more about that than the average user. But in English, especially, part of speech could be unclear and is something used as a noun or a verb. Noun phrase stacking makes terminology very challenging as well. And if something is intended as a verb, yeah, part of speech is important, but I wouldn't put a lot of focus on it in the early phases. One good tip is do not capitalize entries. Leave everything lowercase unless they're proper nouns, or the term should always be capitalized for whatever reason. Acronyms are good to include in the list with the full form as part of the definition. That's also important. Another important thing is what should not be translated, okay? You can also establish a do not translate list specifically, but one other way to handle that is simply include the original term. Let's say the original language is English. The English term should be retained, and that is given as the translation in the term list. So that's the easiest way to enforce compliance, is to basically, if the term should not be translated, just maintain it across all languages in the term list and the resulting term base that might get developed. So again, I'm really focusing on simplicity because I've seen these types of efforts fail due to very gung-ho individuals wanting to have the broadest impact, coming on like a sledgehammer in their organizations. And again, my advice is to keep it simple, drive adoption using simplicity, remove any technical barriers for people to be able to access and use the term list. Make sure it's reliable and it's updated, because the second it's seen as containing spurious information, people will just say, why bother? I can do this on my own. Don't get bogged down with administrative data, as I mentioned early on. That can always come later in terms of how you manage the terms. Here we're talking about just building a core list that's reliable, and people start to see it as a reliable point of reference. So focus on the breadth of technical terms, not the amount of data around each term, and make sure it's good, reliable information and well maintained. Okay, as I was saying, it must be indispensable. Used consistently across departments. So again, that buy-in across your organization is super important. It's a point of reference, and it can become a term base for multiple languages later on once it's established. All right, you don't want to start going down the road of saying, well, let's see how many languages we can get in this if you're still working on building it. We want a solid foundation to work from. So that raises the question, do you need a term base? Now, a term base is just what we in the industry call a terminology database. That's all it is. Instead of using a simple spreadsheet, we use a database structure to store the terms. It gives us more flexibility and eventually allows us to store even more information around each term entry. So when will you know when you've outgrown your term list? Well, a couple of things are the breadth of data you want to track increases. So you start finding there is more information you want to include around each term. We call it maybe administrative information, linguistic information, what products it's used in. So the structure starts to get more complex. Users need a more efficient way to enter and look up info. That's a big one. You have more than a few hundred terms. I mean, Excel, I'd say, is good up to a couple hundred terms. After that, I think you may want to look at another option. And then also if you have 2 or more languages to manage. A term list is fine if it's 1 or 2 languages. When you start getting the multiple languages, now it gets really difficult to manage not only the linguistic entries, but also the administrative data around it in one table. So these are all indicators that you need something more robust like a database. And don't run off and just start creating your own. There are people who created whole careers on building terminology management databases. Data modeling for term bases is a big area has been historically big area of discussion for the experts. But one basic thing that you want to know about these databases is that you want a concept-oriented term base. Now, what is that? What makes a term base concept-oriented is that no language has to be the primary. In other words, you could enter a term in any language and link it to any other, to the corresponding term in any other language. Essentially, the database contains a list of concepts, and what you're doing is those concepts are essentially getting a numeric ID, and around those concepts you're hanging terms across multiple languages. So as I said, the concepts are language independent. That's kind of a weird thing to think about. How can a concept be language independent? Well, I have an example, a little exercise we'll go through. But generally, concept-oriented term bases are considered a best practice in the industry and offer the best structure for growth and management. So here's a quick exercise. Envision a shape that has 4 sides, but don't give it a name. Okay, so just envision that shape. It has 4 sides. It could be a viereck, quadrato, quadrada, a square. You notice I didn't try to pronounce it in Chinese. That's a simple example of what a concept-oriented term base does. It doesn't require a name in order to track the concept. And in the individual language entries, that's where the names get added. So if I was writing in German, the entry would be viereck. And then it could be linked to any other language that represents that concept. Okay, a quick plug for one of our tools at Mad Translations. For those who may not be familiar with MadCap's translation memory tool, it's CAT tool as we call it, that's Lingo. Lingo does have a terminology management database included in the software, and it is a concept-oriented term base. And it uses a simple structure to capture terms and create a multilingual term base. As I said, it's included with Lingo, and the benefit is that it puts it in a structured form that is now portable to other translation providers. If you're already working with a translation company, for example, and you've built a term base in the Lingo term base tool, you have options to export that to industry standard TBX, for example, and share your term base with your provider. And if you are doing, let's say, translation in-house and your translator is using Lingo, the term base interacts directly with the translation memory tool, and so allows lookup and reuse of terms, enables that much more easily within that interface. So it's if you have Lingo, you already have it, you may not have used it, but it's a tool that's important to mention also because Lingo is also a sister product for Flare, MadCap Flare, and integrates with Flare for enabling translation of Flare projects. So I thought it important here to mention that you may already have tools in your arsenal available to you. Okay, so just to wrap up and leave some time for questions, a quick summary. First of all, just decide that terminology is important for your organization, okay? I'll be honest, I don't think marketers would have a big issue with it because it can drive content marketing and keyword marketing. Terminology management and keyword development are very closely linked. So gain that consensus across your organization. Make sure everyone's on the same page as to the importance of this initiative. Start simply with a very simple term list. Build and prove its value first, and then focus on make it more technically robust and slick for people to use and interact with. Mike, I'll kick it back to you.
All right, thanks, Scott. Before we get to Mad World, we have a couple questions here that we can address. Scott, why should you not capitalize entries?
That's a really good question. The main reason is first of all, in some languages, it can cause confusion when translating as to how to represent a term. But also, if you capitalize it, and I'm thinking ahead, we want clean data as your process evolves. So if you think ahead and you develop a more robust term base using, let's say, Lingo term-based tool or something else, those term matches are going to appear in a translator's interface and will automatically get pulled in. And if it's in a context where a capitalized version of a term doesn't make sense, then you're creating more work because now it has to be decapitalized. So it's best to start in a in lowercase as a default is what I always recommend. Some term bases allow you to make terms case insensitive at the entry level, but again, this is when we're getting more robust. So if you're starting out simply, the best advice is don't use capitals on common nouns or other terms, but obviously capitalize brand names and things as appropriate, proper nouns and brand names as appropriate.
Good. Okay, Scott, is there ever an argument for new terminology, such as a terminology rebrand or refresh?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a whole field for developing neologisms, and that's a really good point because very often you don't want to leave that to the translator to figure out, right? Because that's very often where a new term can fail because it can be misunderstood during translation. And that's where some of the most famous translation faux pas occur, right? So new terminology development is super critical. And if it's going to a brand, product, or name, it deserves even extra attention because now you want to consider cultural aspects of a name. Will that name, how it sounds in another language, could it be offensive or off-putting to a user or a customer? When that brand name is rendered in another language that doesn't use our alphabet, the Latin alphabet, could it look like something else that could be wrong or again, offensive? So you have to be very careful about new term development, especially when it's around branding. And there's just there are bunches of textbook examples of how this has gone wrong. Going back to the turn of the century, the famous Buick LaCrosse in Canada. Buick had a model called the LaCrosse that they wanted to market and sell in Canada. And someone didn't do their brand research in Quebec where that term had a very specific meaning that had a sexual connotation among teenagers. And again, it's just not, was it a huge brand faux pas? Borderline. It made a lot of news in our industry, but it's one of those cases where a little bit of homework could have avoided some embarrassment. That could have become very expensive. So.
Hey, Scott, what if many of the terms in a company are acronyms? That is all caps.
Oh yeah, acronyms can go in as caps, of course. But the biggest thing about capturing acronyms is defining them. When you capture, if you're going to bother capturing them, make sure they're well defined, and definitely treat them as full terms. So the definition isn't just necessarily the full version of the acronym. You also want to include a definition if possible. And those sample context sentences are also really helpful. But yeah, acronyms are the bane to translators because they can be really unclear to users. And when you cross languages, they can become even more unclear. So in English, someone might be able to guess an acronym if they're not sure, or intuit that from the context, but users of other languages won't be able to do that as readily. So you definitely want to capture them. And acronyms are the first thing I'd want to capture in the term list.
Good. Well, thank you, Scott. I think that's all the questions for now. But if anyone has any follow-up questions, wants to have a follow-up meeting to talk about these things, feel free to contact us at sales@madtranslations.com. We're happy to help you out. And as a reminder, we do have Mad World coming up October 8th through 11th. An in-person Mad World as well as the virtual Mad World, and there is an early registration available up through April 30th. I'll be there as well as a few members of our production team, so it'd be great to meet you all and answer any questions there as well. But like I said, don't hesitate to reach out to us at sales@madtranslations.com, and we're happy to help you work through these things and help you out however we can. Thank you all for coming. There were some questions about the recording being emailed out and things like that. The recording will be made available. I believe it's going to be the same link that was used to enter the webinar today, but those details will be sent out here shortly. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott. It was a lot of information, and I hope it was helpful to everybody.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for attending.